You are listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast with Buck Joffrey. Get ready to change your life.
Hello, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula Podcast. Back today here with Zed Williamson. This time not so much as a person I'm interviewing, but rather as a co-host. Welcome, Zed.
Thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about something that I think is a very, very important topic, especially when it comes to successful professionals and people who are very conservative when it comes to life. And what we're going to talk about is the idea of taking risks and the fear of failure and how all of those things are creating a type of wall in your life that potentially may be preventing you from living it to its fullest, whether that be in business, whether that be in your personal life, etc.
Right, because failure is horrible, right? I should always avoid failure.
Right, exactly. And in fact, if you think about failure, and I'm going to put on my doctor hat for a moment, here's an interesting thing, and this is not very medical, I was just kidding about that. But I have this hypothesis and this thesis, I should say, that basically we are all hardwired to take risks, Ed. Here's why. Have you ever seen a baby just get up and walk from birth? That would be scary. I think Kim Jong-il in North Korea, I think was somebody who did that, and he also was able to read, books by the second week of his life, etc. But most of us, mortal people, actually had to get up a few times and fall, and I've seen this very many times. As you know, I have 3 little girls. The youngest one is 15 months, and she is only a veteran of walking for about 5 months. But she kept standing up. She'd fall down. She'd try to get back up. She didn't quit. She didn't say, well, looks like I can't walk. That's that. Right? And so
exactly.
every baby that needs to start talking, for example, my baby, my youngest is 15 months. She's not talking yet. She understands a lot. But she's cooing. She's trying. And that doesn't mean that someday she's not potentially going to be an incredibly eloquent speaker, because I suspect that at some point the most eloquent speakers in the world were cooing. But they had to keep trying, and they'd mispronounce words, and they'd they'd say things that made their parents say, oh, how cute, the child, can't speak very well, and all the things that we do. And that kid goes on to become one of the great speakers in the world. Aaron Rodgers had to throw a football a few times before he became, as good a football player as he was. Right?
And I think, absolutely. And I think the fear of failure that grows as we age can cause a very scary paralysis. And people see failure as this negative term when it's not at all.
Why do you think that is?
Well, to me, failure is, if you want to label it the universe or your life, but what failure is a sign to course correct. It's feedback that you get to act on. It's different than mistakes. Mistakes, if you make mistakes over and over again, well, you might be a moron, I guess. I don't know. But when it comes to failure means that you pushed harder than what was comfortable, and you grew and you learned, and that knowledge allows you to take your next step in a better direction. And people who live in a life in fear of failure, they're scared of lack of comfort, and that comfort can be paralyzing.
So why do you think that they have that sense of comfort? Because there is a change. If you think about what I just said, which was my thesis, is that people are hardwired to take risks. What happens?
Comfort overall, success overall, it doesn't matter how you define it, breeds a sort of laziness in my mind. And once you choose to not do something out of fear, that choice grows. And every time fear allows you to not do something, the fear becomes more powerful. And I think that's why, if an adult had to learn how to walk, many times fear would get in the way. And so I think we are hardwired because it's a means for survival in our young years. But then it turns out that it's just too easy to live. Not as many people would be alive today that are alive today a couple thousand years ago. And that ease of life, I think, creates a paralyzing comfort.
Well, I don't think, and it's interesting that you say that, because I think there's, I was trying to get a specific answer out of you, which I was biased towards, which was that I believe that it's our school systems. And if you look at all of us really successful professionals, people who went on to get, their college degrees, and then they went on to get the advanced degrees, and then went to professional school, and they went on to get these prestigious jobs, all of us, the type of learning that we did in order to get the accolades, to get the honors, and to get people to say, wow, you're a fancy doctor, you're a fancy lawyer, they had to do with a very different kind of success. And that kind of success where somebody spoon feeds you something, you learn it, and then they ask you a question and you get it right. And so you're rewarded for that. It's a highly theoretical world, right? You are told what you're supposed to learn. You're told that, here's what I'm going to test you on. Okay, so take notes. Right? The real world doesn't really work that way, but that's the way our educational system works. I'm no expert in education, but I'll tell you that I truly believe that the problem with very hyper-successful professionals is not experiencing failure over and over again, being okay with it, and then getting back up. In other words, if you want to learn to walk, it's not going to be, you got to take one shot and you can't walk, so you're going to forget about it. No, that's not the way it works. And it also doesn't work by somebody telling you, this is how you walk. You got to get up, you got to balance, you got to put one foot in front of the other. You actually have to do it. And that theoretical pounding that we get throughout our education system does not exist when you're out on your own in the real world.
That's a very good point. I think we've had conversations in the past where you refer to the idea of failure as, you're building up some scar tissue. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so scar tissue, this is where the idea is basically this, okay? I see life, and I see business in particular, not as a linear pathway. I don't see it as something that someone's going to tell me how to do it and I'm going to go do it. I'm going to create my own destiny with my own ideas, and I've got side rails along the way that are going to keep me on course. I'm going to make a lot of failures along the way, but I'll figure out the answer, right? And those back and forths along the side rails, those bumps and bruises you take along the way, they create a certain kind of scar tissue that makes it harder and harder for failures to penetrate you, right? They also make it much harder for you to fail. If you look at it, let's talk about scar tissue theoretically in terms of what it is on tissue. Okay, we'll say, here's a good idea. Let's not scar tissue, but anybody who plays a lot of racket sports, you get these little calluses on your right on your hands there, right where you're holding a racket. And the idea behind that is you've taken a bunch of hits to that area and your body's responding. Your body's responding by creating thicker tissue there so that when you hit the ball, it no longer hurts your hands because your body's ready for it. I think in theory, that's the way I view life, is if you don't take chances, you don't create scar tissue, and therefore you can't keep pushing farther and farther.
Absolutely. It's interesting because people will attribute the idea of failure with a negative connotation, and you can pick up on that when you meet someone pretty quickly, what their belief is about it. And so what I would challenge our listeners is, what do you believe is failure? Do you align it with any other thing? What would your synonym for failure be? Would you call it regret? Well, if you call it that, I think you're wrong. Failure is what breeds health. It growth. It's required to achieve, and to ever think that you can avoid it on purpose just means that you will basically shrink over time.
Sometimes I think about it this way, and I've mentioned this parallel before, but obviously having gotten to where I did with medical school and then on to neurosurgery residency, and then I left that, and we'll get in that in a second, but I had to be good at tests. I had to be good at multiple choice tests. And one of the things that I realized, and by the way, if anybody's about to get ready for a test like an LSAT or an MCAT or a national board examination, I'll tell you exactly how to do really, really well, because I was very good at this. What you have to do is get your hand on every question you can possibly get. Okay? You just have to get the material. You got to learn the material first a little bit. Not that much. You just have to, read the chapter a little bit, listen to the lectures, etc. And then you got to do questions after questions after questions. And the reason for that is that the questions can only be asked in so many different ways. So if you have any material, anything, any body of knowledge, you can only be tested on that in so many different ways. There is a finite way to be tested. In other words, the way that the most successful people in my medical school class studied was by reading quickly, listening to lectures, and then taking test questions. And you know what? Every time they got something wrong, they would look up in the answer why the answer was wrong, and they'd see what was right. But the pain of getting it wrong created sort of a Pavlovian feedback, right? It hurts for a second. Then you look at what's right, and you never forget. Again, scar tissue, right? That's scar tissue. And so the real world can work like that too. But you have to take risks. And even if you don't take risks, at least identify if you've made a wrong decision, right? Because that's everything that we do in life is about taking risks. Like, for example, in my case, when I finished medical school, I decided I want to be a brain surgeon. So I I got into a very competitive residency and to do neurosurgery residency. And after a year or so, I realized that I really love neuroscience. I love the brain, but I don't like the hours of a neurosurgeon. So I decided to transfer, and so I did something a little bit less intensive on my life. But you can call that a failure, or you can call it a recognition that something isn't working, something isn't jiving with your life, and you have to have the courage of your convictions to make a decision that actually will change your identity. Because for that period of time when I was a neurosurgery resident, I had created this image of myself as this, top of the hierarchy, top of the food chain, brain surgeon, wow. That kind of image for myself. And in order to move away from that, I had to check my ego in at the door. And I had to say, this doesn't fit with who I am. Right? This doesn't fit with who I am, because I'm a guy now who loves to spend time with his family. That's inconsistent with this image of myself. Therefore, I have to admit that I've made a wrong decision and go through the pain of discovery and go try to do and find something else that works better.
I think it's important to recognize that the why, so you felt that line of medicine was going to lead to a lifestyle that didn't really fulfill what truly mattered to you. So because you had deep resolve in that belief is what allowed you to course correct on a failure. And the failure, let's label it as a decided direction. Okay, I'm going this direction. And then you get to the end, or not the end, but you move along that path and you go, gosh, I failed in this choice. So sometimes the comfortable thing to do is like, well, I guess I'm here, and maybe I should just keep going. And I think a lot of people think that way. I think a lot of people go, well, I'm here, it's convenient. A lot of other people are moving this direction. Turning left is so much energy, I'll just stay here. And they think, well, it's going to get better. If I get paid more, then it would be worth it. Or if I do it for 10 years, then it'll be worth it. I think it's important to recognize, like you said, early on, have a belief system that allows you to go, boom, failure, awesome, move. It's like getting shot at. If it gets close, you're going to move, and that's I think that's the way to respond.
And it's interesting because a lot of times that's the hardest thing to do, right? Is to say, okay, I've got a comfortable, quote unquote, comfortable. I've been through this before. I don't believe there's a such thing as a safe, comfortable job unless you've seen the books and you're in charge of them. But there's the resistance of moving on to something that is more desirable or what you'd rather do, etc. That's one kind of problem that I see, which is not being able to pivot when in your mind that's the right thing to do. And the other thing is being flat out fired. In other words, now you don't have a choice, right? So now you don't have a choice, and that is a golden moment for anybody's life. And I can't even tell you how many people I know who the defining moment in their life was to get fired, okay? So the defining moment, that was for me in part. I'll talk about that some other time, but the defining moment was to get fired. And the reason for that is because it creates a certain kind of instability that's not part of your everyday life. And I've said this before, but the Chinese word for crisis is the same word for opportunity. And I think it's very apropos because when comfort or apathy is taken away from you and you no longer have a choice, that's the time to define yourself.
It's almost like it reverts you, so someone getting fired, it kind of makes me think of, how you had mentioned that we're hardwired to take risks. When you get fired, you're removed from a situation and it's a must. It's like, well, you can't stay fired. So you go back to where we are when we're a year old and we fall down. I need to walk. I fall down. Well, you know what? I just got to get up and walk again. And it kind of happens to you. So here you're an adult and you're supporting a family and a house and all this. You get fired. Well, it's like a kid falling down. You don't have a choice. And so it creates the right mindset a lot of the time because you slough off all the stupid, laziness and emotions and safety nets and comfortableness, and you just get the job done. And if you can identify that trigger for yourself, then you can actually create it without getting fired.
Yeah, I think it's really hard for people, though. I think it's just because we spend so much time, in grade school and high school and college and so on and so forth. Well, at least, people like me did that. It's hard to unprogram that. So let's go into real world examples then. So tell me a defining moment. Give me an aha moment where you had some sort of failure or some sort of realization that made you pull away and change the way you do things for the better.
Sure. I like to talk about ones that are painful. There's always a bunch of little failures and ones that still may make you pivot slightly. The big pivots, though, I think are important. And it goes back to a concept that I try to keep in my mind. We as humans have these pretty fancy brain thingies, and there's some drawbacks to how we're set up. Confirmation bias is one of them, where we will do our best to find the justification for what we already believe, and that could put you in a pretty tough spot. And another one is a normalization of deviance. And the idea behind this is you make a decision up front. So I was in business, and we had decided to add a service line, and I was going to sub out this service line because I felt like it was a little less risky than doing it in-house. And, we probably could be profitable, and over time we could build it up and we'd be fine. And so I believed that, and that was the steps that I took. What I didn't do is I didn't create a point where if this, then bail, kind of a mindset. And I mention normalization of deviance because this is something, and there's an astronaut who does a great talk about this because we're related to the Challenger explosion back in the 80s. And I'll mention it. I'll do a quick or long story short type of a situation because it's important for anybody, whether you're in business or not. The idea was, there was this O-ring that was in the booster rocket, and it kept the fuel away from very hot stuff, and that's pretty important when you're, sitting on thousands of pounds of fuel that is designed to take a massive piece of metal into the atmosphere or out of the atmosphere. And what they decided when they developed this is we're going to launch this, and then we're going to check it out when it falls back to Earth. And if this O-ring had failed, then we need to ground the fleet. No more flights. So it was in the 60s. The rocket takes off. It falls back to Earth. O-ring failed. Holy moly, ground the fleet. Well, that's what they were supposed to do. The problem is there was a lot of pressure coming from media, politicians. It was, the race to space. And so what they said was, well, it didn't cause any problems. It was probably just a one-time. So let's launch again. So they launched, and they checked, and the O-ring had failed. And again, they were supposed to ground the fleet. Well, fast forward 20 years, I can't remember the exact number, but let's say they did 17 flights every time that O-ring had failed. And in the beginning, that O-ring failing meant no one fly again. And by the end, before the Challenger flight, it turned into, hey, we expect this thing to fail. Well, unfortunately, in the Challenger flight, it failed at a different time, and the entire space shuttle exploded, and people lost their lives. And they lost their lives from something that everyone knew about 20 years earlier, but because they didn't feel pain, they didn't get that emotional kick. It's like touching a pot that's not hot and then deciding for the rest of your life that pots will never be hot. That's the normalization of deviance. What they, in the beginning, decided we cannot deviate in this direction, it becomes the normal, and then someone loses their life. And what happened to us is the same thing. Is I made a decision. It was costing money, but it wasn't costing that much money. So you kind of take your eyes away from it. You don't really want to see the data that's proving your decision bad, so you let it go. And in the end, it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Where if it had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in one day, the pain would have made me move. So to me, that was a failure that we learned from, and we shifted. But I think I could even handled that failure better by recognizing the potential pain earlier on.
The O-ring reminds me of the U.S. stock market right now. Right? Bloated, corporate earnings down, stock market indices at records highs, and everybody with their retirement account continues to kind of just blindly throw money in a 401k that's invested broadly in these indices through mutual funds. Right? It sounds crazy, but I see a parallel there.
Absolutely.
I have to say that I am one of the biggest failures I know. All right, I've just got failures left and right. When it came to, and I say that tongue in cheek a little bit, but the point is that I've taken a lot of risks, and that's kind of been my way of navigating the world, right? And I thought one of my biggest risks one of the biggest risks that I took, and I didn't even think about it as a risk at the time because, I grew up in a real estate family. I've mentioned that before on this podcast, and my father's been investing in real estate for years since I was born in the late 60s. He basically came to this country And by the way, immigrants have a much more natural inclination toward entrepreneurship because they tend to, especially when they come from countries that are not quite as, doing quite as well, are much closer to the earth. They're much more close to that sort of, sense that there's not a some kind of safety net there, right? So they see opportunity. But anyway, my father was very early when he came to this country, got into real estate, and even though he was an engineer, he was very, very sharp, and gave up his job within just a couple of years of actually getting here. And so I grew up in a real estate family, and so the biggest thing for me about real estate was that I believed in investing in real estate, and I wasn't afraid of it, which is what a lot of people are. And for me, it was just I wasn't afraid of it because I was around it all the time. But when I took a little shot at it myself, of course, I didn't consult my dad on this or anything like that because I figured I knew everything. I basically did what I thought I was supposed to do. I looked at, I saw a property. I looked at the financials. They made sense. And back then, I was looking at properties with, where am I getting the highest return on investment, right? So for the first time, I was trying to buy an apartment building for myself. And this is a few years ago now. And all I did was look at the numbers. And what ended up happening is that the property ended up being a big lemon. And the biggest reason was that it wasn't in a great neighborhood. I couldn't find a good property manager. I couldn't find anybody who could stabilize the apartment building. And I certainly wasn't going to do it because even though I love real estate, I don't know anything about, toilets, tenants, and termites, as they say.
Right.
I believe in asset investing. So what happened is I took a big loss on that building. I ended up selling it for a pretty substantial loss. It is it is what it is, right? Now I learned from that, and since then I've acquired multiple apartment buildings. I've made numerous other investments, and I know there's certain things I'm not going to do. Like before I ever buy an apartment building, I'm going to make sure I have a property manager that I trust and that I believe is going to keep that building stabilized. I'm going to get their opinion on it. I'm going to, in a past podcast, I used to say that I only look at, buildings that are going to give me a certain return on investment. And I said, a cap rate of 10, which those of you who are in real estate might know what that means. It's very high. I don't think that way anymore because I understand that sometimes you have to pay a price for stability, right? So sometimes you have to look at not only the return on investment on a sheet of paper, but you have to look at the big picture. And the only way you can do that is, unfortunately, again, is to get some scar tissue. You have to go through the motions and understand all the variables that you have to look at. And anybody who wants to be a real estate investor or invest in real estate has to understand that.
Well, it's good to appreciate those opportunities to learn, because if that situation had ended as you kind of breaking even or maybe doing okay, then you might have hung on to the property and you wouldn't have lost, quote unquote, the investment, but you also wouldn't have gained the education that impacted so many more highly profitable investments moving forward. So that failure or price you paid, was a true worthy investment in your own education. And once you recognize that, you're okay making decisions, knowing that, look, I'm either going to walk away achieving what I wanted, or I'm going to walk away with a better know-how of how to achieve what I want.
Right, exactly. And here's another little tip, though. That one of the other ways that you can potentially build sort of artificial scar tissue, get street smarts without going through the pain, is to hire a consultant. Okay, so I didn't used to believe in this, but I believe in this now. I mean, you do have to get a good consultant. You have to get a good consultant. It's the old saying that, the problem with consult is that the first three letters in the word spell con. Well, that's there is some truth to that. I've run into some con men and whatever, but a lot of times what you'll find is if you can find a reliable consultant, and first of all, they're not going to be cheap. Okay, they're never cheap. I've probably spent this year alone $50,000 in consultants for various types of new business activity I'm doing. But I don't see it as an expense. I don't see an expense at all, because I know now the cost of those mistakes along the way when you're building a business. It can be astronomical. It can be 4, 5, 6, 7 times that in the types of things that I'm doing. So I'm a firm believer in identifying an area that I want to get involved with, finding out somebody who's really good at it, who's willing to teach me and to pay them good money to do it. Now, the other thing I'll tell you is, we talk a lot about on this show, because this show isn't just about entrepreneurship. It is encouraging entrepreneurship, but it is also about thinking about the way you invest in financial education. So if you're convinced you're not an entrepreneur, how can you use some of this information? Well, one of the ways that you can use this information is by understanding that the people that you invest with, they should have failures under their belt. Because if you talk to somebody and you say, tell me about a deal that didn't work for you, or so on and so forth, and they say, well, no, I've never had a deal that didn't work for me, turn around and run away. A master surgeon in my residency program used to say to me that his thing was, whenever something bad happened, and we used to do the most complicated cases because it was this tertiary hospital in San Francisco, and he'd say, if you haven't had complications in surgery, you haven't operated enough. Well, that's true for everything, really, right?
Absolutely.
And so that doesn't mean you go to the guy who's never had complications. I mean, that doesn't mean you invest with the person who's never had a deal go south. I mean, shoot, they're probably due for one, right? They're probably due for one. So you want to find somebody who's had a few failures and has learned from it.
Well, because anybody who says they haven't either lied or has not done any. They haven't tried at all. I mean, it's that's another important part is don't invest with people who lie. So
well, and
they
that's
say they haven't failed.
Well, it's not only that. I mean, it's they you may just not have done enough deals. I mean, that's the reality of it. I mean, I've done plenty of things in my life. Where you do 1,000 of something and everything goes great, and then 1,001 something didn't go great, and you don't understand why. I mean, it's just the reality of it. But that shouldn't scare you off from investing with somebody, because it's at least you can gauge those kinds of risks a little bit better. I mean, if you are, I'm bringing this up because I was just looking at apartment buildings in Oklahoma, which is a good market, I think, for a variety of reasons. But anyway, one of the things I kept thinking about was, gosh, there's a lot of tornadoes out here, isn't there? So yeah, there are tornadoes. So of course, if you're going to invest in Oklahoma, you might want to ask whoever is sponsoring a deal, well, what do you think about those tornadoes? What do you think of the problem? And what are we going to do if a tornado comes and we have a ton of damage? Am I going to lose a bunch of money? See if somebody's thought about those kinds of things. You got to think about the worst case scenario. But those are those are things that sometimes you just can't control, right? They're things that you can't control. There can be all sorts of natural disasters in California. You can have earthquakes, you can hurricanes in California, in Florida, and so on and so forth. But At least those things you can say, well, there was a reason for it. You see, there was a natural disaster. Whereas in the stock market, where most people think they are investing for the quote-unquote long run, they just keep throwing their money in blind. And then you have these 30% corrections, 40% corrections, and what I believe will be a 50 to 60% correction coming up within the next couple of years. And people don't think twice about it, right? They don't think, because they keep throwing money blind into something, probably don't even look at what money's in there, right? But that's not the way to go. The reality is that's not how the rich get richer. The rich get richer by investing in things that they understand, that they see as good opportunities. And 1 or 2 of them out of 10 might fail, but those 7 or 8 that do great make them tenfold on their investment.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I think that is I think that's ultimately the moral of the story here. I think the moral of the story is, first of all, if you've got a W-2 job and you're out there and you're thinking about entrepreneurship, ask yourself the question, if I got up and tried to walk, and if I haven't tried to walk, why not? And that walking may be very simple. It doesn't have to be you quit your job one day and the next day, you're out there starting some .com. It doesn't have to be like that. And I'm going to show you. I'm going to have a guest very soon on the show that shows you that you can be a professional and do all this stuff and still keep your day job. Okay, I'm going to have that.
There'll be some chances for people to maybe get some fun scar tissue.
That's right. Well, there may be some of that, but there's also an opportunity here if you are if you're really worried about this stuff, and honestly, if you're just working 70, 80 hours a week, like my neighbor, my neighbor's my friend Hamadi, he's a neurosurgeon, and I look at him, and the guy, bless him. I mean, he works so hard, man. It's so hard. And I look at him, and he loves what he does, and good for him. But all I can tell you is I'm glad I made the choice not to go not to keep on that route, because I couldn't work like that. But it's unrealistic to think of a guy like that who's, he loves what he does. He's saving lives. He's doing all this stuff out there, but he doesn't have time to go out and start a business and go to learn and invest real estate. He doesn't have time to do that, and he's doing great. He's doing very, very well for himself financially. But what I would say to him, which I have said to him on a number of occasions, is you got to stop investing in the stock market, and you got to start looking at things that won't take you very much time. There's people out there who are reliable, and most of the time are going to get you returns that you could only wish for in the stock market. And so think about that. Don't be afraid to get out there. Try to create multiple streams of income. Try to make it so if you don't want to work all the time, you don't have to work all the time. The goal is to slowly, if not abruptly through being the entrepreneur yourself, but at least investing to create multiple streams of income so that you can work if you want to work. And if you don't want to, you don't have to work either. And that's our entire ethos at Wealth Formula Podcast. Is that any last words of wisdom?
No, I think that's it. Get out and fail.
Get out and fail. Well, thanks again, Zed, and we'll talk to you soon. That's it for Wealth Formula Podcast today.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast. Visit us on the web at wealthformula.com. The information contained in this podcast are opinions, not fact. As always, consult your own financial team before making any investment. See you next time.